Welcome back, everyone. Our next speaker will be Brendan Sheehan from Honeywell. As Senior Marketing Manager, Refining for Honeywell Process Solutions, Brendan has been responsible for strategy and execution of Honeywell's automation solutions for the refining industry globally. With 28 years' experience in the refining and petrochemical industry, Brendan's current role involves defining and developing automation solutions tailored to the refining industry, including instrumentation, DCS advanced solutions, and supply chain. Prior to this assignment in Honeywell, Brendan worked for ExxonMobil at Fawley, as well as Yanpet in Yanbu, Saudi Arabia. Please join me in welcoming Brendan Sheehan.
Girl, we couldn't get much higher. Come on, baby, light my fire. Come on, baby, light my fire.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to you all today. I do want to just correct Mark a little bit. My current role now is I'm the global marketing leader for our projects and automation solutions at Honeywell. So I cover all of the industries these days from our automation perspective. So I guess what I want to talk to you about today is a little bit about the relationship of the work that Honeywell and PAS do together. So I'll slightly change the order there a little bit and talk a little bit first about the PAS-Honeywell partnership. We'll talk a little bit about Doc 4000 and really how, what I thought I would do today is talk a little bit about how Honeywell makes use of tools like Doc 4000, in particular Doc 4000 actually, in a lot of the types of projects that we get involved in on a daily basis all around the globe. So large scale, both migration projects and indeed, as we'll talk about, Greenfield projects. We'll talk a little bit about project integrity, and I'll just try to relay to you some of the benefits that we've heard from customers and that we've experienced ourselves. So hopefully that will not keep you from the next session, and I'll try to be brief about that. So basically, Honeywell has enjoyed a long and fruitful partnership with PAS. We basically started around 17 years ago, back in 1997, when Honeywell signed on as a single reseller or a single provider of, exclusive provider of Doc 3000. And it's one of the tools that we used to provide configuration management for our TDC 3000 system. Since then, we've progressed on to using the tools for Doc 4000, which has expanded its capability, and now beyond TDC 3000, it now takes on all our other newer systems like Experian, as well as various other other databases, such as those belonging to Yokogawa, Invensys, Emerson, etc. And in fact, I think they cover something like, and the PAS guys will tell you this in the other room, something like over 50 systems are supported around with Doc 4000. After that, they included Recon and IMAC, and these are additional components that provide ability to do sorts of things like management of change across the process control network. And in 2012, we continued on and looked at how they could deliver Doc 4000 in a cloud environment and deliver it as a software as a service. And most recently, we've worked together, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, around project integrity to offer an ongoing sort of plant project database reconciliation tool to basically reconcile the various databases that are used during large Greenfield projects using the Intergraph Smart Plant Instrumentation database as the baseline. So that's some of the areas that we've collaborated on and that we make use of the Doc 4000 tool. So if I start by looking at some of the original areas, so here you can look at in the beginning, Doc 3000 was used as a way to provide simplified relationships between the various components of a TDC 3000 system. And for those of you who've been around the automation system like myself for about 30 years, you'll probably fondly remember working on things like CL programs and how they interrelated to the various controllers, logic blocks, and and various systems around the TDC platform. And Doc 3000 was a really capable tool of identifying where all the instrumentation was used in those various applications that we used to deliver in CL, basically. And back in those days, in fact, a lot of advanced regulatory controls and indeed advanced control systems were done in CL programs, and they were pretty complex. And it was important to have a tool like Doc 3000 to be able to document those things. And even further, and I have to admit I sort of less fondly remember this, is the use of trying to wade through things like Picture Editor to build sub-pictures that we used to configure the graphics that we used to do in TPS and stuff. And I must admit, I'm glad we moved away from some of that. It was pretty hard work, but it was also complicated, and there wasn't an easy way to to identify where all of the inputs to those graphics were. So you needed a tool like Doc 3000 to be able to identify if somebody was working on something, you know, what was going to happen to those graphics, and make sure that they'd continue working. So now, PAS did a great job with providing that for things like TPS and TDC 3000, but not content with that, they moved on and went from looking at a system like TDC, but also expanded that to our new Experian platform. And the Experian platform is configured really in a quite different way. The input blocks, the output blocks, the control blocks are completely standalone and separate. We don't have CL now, we have CAB, custom algorithm blocks. They can be standalone or integrated with the controllers, and the graphics are done with HMI web and different components all together. So that all has to be connected in the same sort of way, and the identifications, again, between the instrumentation, the inputs and outputs connected to those programs, controllers, and graphics. But indeed, Doc 4000 covers not just the Honeywell system, but it covers Emerson, it covers Yokogawa, it covers Invensys, and indeed for many of you customers out there, it's not unusual to have a mixture of different vendors' DCS platforms. I mean, it's very common to see somebody have a DCS that might be Honeywell and a safety system that comes from another vendor, for example, Triconics or Invensys, or Yokogawa or Emerson. So you've got to be able to manage that database as a control systems manager and to be able to track where all of your data is and how it's used on your automation, on your plant. So really what we have then is in Doc 4000 is an engineering toolkit that's used to manage that system configuration, right? So, and what it really does is aggregates the data across those various potentially disparate systems securely across the networks, and allows you to provide that information contextualize that information in a way that identifies all the relationships, tracks the changes, identifies various hierarchies that exist in the control strategies, which indeed, as you know, can be quite complicated. And in fact, you can also use it to expose potential configuration errors that might be there. So for example, if you're involved in a large project and you're building, and maybe you've got different people around the globe working on a project, you can have situations where you've even got multiple EPCs. So a large project can be executed by a number of different people in different offices all around the globe. And now you want to make sure that you are configuring, you know, common loops the same way, so that in flow controllers you're using a similar PID algorithm, that you're providing the same sort of tuning, that you're not putting derivative on your flow controllers, for example. And you want to be able to see that's done consistently in the same way. So things, valves fail open or fail close in common situations, and you want to be able to query that. And tools like Doc 3000 is exactly the type of tool that allows you to do that kind of thing. It also indeed extends to other types of configuration, which I should have mentioned on the previous page, but covers things like your advanced control applications. So now, as we see the commonly use of things like multivariable controllers, such as our own RMPCT profit controller or DMC+, you want to know that if somebody's working on a flow controller or a temperature or a pressure, is that going to cause an alarm to that young engineer or maintenance guy goes out and starts working on that transmitter? Is that going to cause an alarm to the operator on the panel and he's going to chew the guy out because he didn't give him a warning? Or is it going to be a critical input to a multivariable controller, which is now going to shed and you potentially lose profits? Or, worst case scenario, and God forbid that would happen, is, it's part of a shutdown system and you trip the plant. So that's not the sort of place you want to get to. But Doc 4000 is a tool from an execution standpoint that really helps identify some of that stuff. Make sure you avoid inconsistent configuration, and it really helps facilitate that kind of collaboration between multiple engineers, which are commonly, in our case, commonly not co-located in the same spot, right? They can be all over the globe as we do these types of projects. So how does Doc 4000, for example, solve some of the challenges we see in the industry today? Now I must admit, I'm not going to claim that Doc 4000 is the panacea for all problems in our industry. Clearly, that's not the case. But indeed, it does contribute to helping solve some of the issues that we see. So, for example, we're constantly striving for improvement in productivity. Use of Doc 4000, for example, is a very helpful tool to reduce the time it takes to do some research on a tag, where it's been used, what it's been used as, and what types of configuration it's been used in. That's time that can be spent best troubleshooting the process rather than searching around where various tags are being used in a database. It can be used as a sort of a knowledge transfer mechanism. So as we see an aging workforce, especially in the mature regions, how are you going to transfer that knowledge of what you've got configured on your plant to a new young engineer coming in? And I might add that Doc 4000 is a tool that makes it maybe a little more palatable to one of those young engineers that comes in that spent a lot of his time lately using Apple iPhones and Google and the like, and suddenly you're asking him to interrogate a 1970s vintage TDC 2000 or 3000 system. He's going to roll his eyes at you if he hasn't got something like Doc 4000 to work on. So, no, I joke a little bit, but in some respects I've seen that. So it's also useful, and they have a nice demo of this in the back room here, for handling management of change of your automation system, a critical process that you need to take care of as you develop your system or modify your system through the course of its life cycle. And of course, as we talked about, it's important that you understand what those tags are doing before somebody works them. So if anyone's working on maintenance, you know what the impact is of working on one of those tags, and that helps you prevent safety incidents. But they can in fact be involved too in plant hazard analysis, where, for example, sometimes you see customers will use things like logic blocks to provide various layers of protection in their system. And that has to be properly documented then if you're going to use it in that way. And Doc 4000 is a great tool to do that kind of thing. Now, of course, for us in Honeywell, migration projects are one of those areas that, Doc 4000 really pays for itself. I'll be honest, I think this is the area that we find it pays for itself most effectively when we're migrating legacy systems, because, often there are, we're happy to say that we've got systems out there that, are still operating 30 plus years connected to our latest types of systems as well. It's something that Honeywell has taken great pains to provide that kind of longevity and support for our systems. But it does mean that when you come to look at a migration, there may not be anyone on that site that really remembers how that thing was configured in the first place. And I have seen situations like that where people literally don't want to edit software. I can think of a refinery in Northern California, I won't mention the name, but they literally did not want to change any of the programming because they didn't know what the impact would be as if they started to change some of the global variables that were being used as part of those applications. That's a true statement. And so now, something like Doc 4000 is a tool now that really helps us do a couple of things. And we did this recently on a paper plant in California also, actually, where we were able to, first of all, query the plant. It had a legacy Honeywell system and a legacy third-party competitive system on there, and we were migrating it. We wanted to migrate it to Experian. So now we were able to query the whole plant, identify where all of the loops were, do a verification of all the I/O, and be able to re-engineer all the key complex controls that were used to ensure the smooth running of that plant. So they didn't have a lot of multivariable control, but they had a lot of complex loops on there. And that was then had to be all re-engineered back into Experian in our, our new environment, and we wanted to capture all of that information. So we wanted to be able to identify the scope of work properly so that we could quote it properly and give the customer a reasonable bid that's accurate that we could meet. And B, we wanted to make sure that when we did that migration, we were going to be able to do it successfully and they weren't going to lose some of the key functionality that made that plant run smoothly. And we were able to do that, and Doc 4000 was one of the keys to being successful at doing that. So I think I've started, but so I've talked a little bit about migration, but migration projects. But in fact, we also use Doc 4000 in tools like large greenfield plants. And in large greenfield plants, you may think that, okay, is it as useful? In fact, it's very useful. And so here, we now use, so what we use Doc 4000 for here and Project Integrity is it basically uses as a baseline Intergraph's smart plant instrumentation database that's powered by Intools, and we reconcile that. So that database has been built typically by the EPC and is provided then to the control systems vendors like ourselves. Or maybe if it's a large project, it might be a main automation contractor, a MAC contractor. And what it helps do is reconcile the SPI database with the DCS database, the safety system database, the historian, and several other types of databases that might get used as part of that project implementation phase. And so, what you normally see is, is during the course of the progression of that project. And think now, for example, a situation, and this was one we had, large sour gas plant in the Middle East, 95,000 hard I/O, twice as many soft I/O, and 7 EPC contractors involved in doing the job. So a global effort, and now we're the main automation contractor. We need Doc 4000 there to help us start, and we're getting the initial wire instrumentation diagrams, or instrumentation configurations from SPI, but we're all working on it. Everybody's working on it, beavering away around the globe and the different bits. Inevitably, you start to see some divergence. Changes happen, as you can expect on a large project like that, or even on a regular sized project. And so now you've got to manage some of these areas that you've got to reconcile either manually or one way or the other. So for example, looking at where you've configured your I/O slots, what's in them, the tag names, the engineering units, ranges, and of course, if you've got smart transmitters, all of the additional data that goes alongside those. All of that needs to be captured and reconciled as you go through the course of the project. And of course, what happens is it starts to look a little bit like this because you get some divergence between what the EPC is doing and what the automation vendors are doing with the control database. And so you end up wanting to reconcile the database potentially at several different times. Maybe if you're using multiple EPCs, you're trying to do it at different times. You certainly need to do that before you get to some of those later stages in the project where it's going to start being costly for you to pick up those configuration errors. It's much easier to be able to handle those in your engineering office. Doc 4000 is the tool that allows us to do that reconciliation automatically across those tools and helps us solve which one's right. You don't want to be sitting in the FAT where you've flown in guys from all over the globe They're all staying in hotels, eating on their expensive accounts, their expense accounts, and now you're wondering where you've got all these database errors, which one's right, and you're having to solve that during the FAT or the SAT, or God forbid, during commissioning, when it really starts costing you money. And so trying to get that database solved early as possible and making sure you can do that reconciliation as quickly, as early as possible is, you know, a key to the success of one of these large automation projects. And indeed, yeah, as a point actually, I mean, so one of the things that we see at Honeywell we've been working on is universal channel technology and the use of universal I/O. So what that allows us to do is accommodate those late changes more easily, which we do inevitably see these days. So especially when you've got sort of parts of a plant that are provided by a third-party vendor who's providing a package boiler or a package refrigeration unit, or maybe some piece of the unique piece of the plant that you get from a specialist, or maybe it's the hydrogen plant that's being supplied for a chemical plant or something like that. But you've made some assumptions of what the I/O is, and now the guy comes along at the last minute and tells you, oh, I forgot about all these digitals that I needed, and you've got to accommodate this. Now, we can accommodate some of this stuff using universal I/O, which requires only a software configuration rather than hardwired configurations. But in fact, it means now Doc 4000 has got to keep up with all of that and make sure that that documentation continues to reflect how we've now software configured the changes in the plant. So moving on to thinking a little bit about benefits as to, you know, where do we see the benefits for Doc 4000? Well, really, I think the key thing here is it is its ability to automatically identify the discrepancies that might have, you know, that you might discover during that reconciliation phases. If you're doing that manually, it's going to take more effort and there's potential opportunity for errors. If you're able to do that regularly with an automatic system, you can pick those things up quickly. And once again, you know, now you're not having to worry about, you can get those done and you're confident you've got those done going into the FATs and SATs rather than waiting to figure it out there. And indeed, you know, in days gone by, that has been the case, and it can, in fact, you know, cause a significant delay during those periods of time. And the other point is, of course, you know, if you've then used the tool in the startup, Doc 4000, it then becomes a great tool for handling your management of change throughout the life cycle of the project, and indeed then ultimately, or the life cycle of the plant, if you like, and ultimately becomes the tool that's used then to provide the data for an upgrade of the system at some future point in time. So it really retains its value throughout the course of that lifetime. We've looked at, well, between us, I think we've looked at some of these benefits. Some of the benefits that we've identified here are really around shortening the FAT and the SAT, as we've talked a little bit about already. Providing a faster startup is the other key piece. And here, actually, some of the benefits that we see identified on here didn't come from Honeywell directly. They came from some of the oil majors. So one of the major oil companies identified, you know, the cost of doing projects with integrity and without integrity, and really felt like it was a big labor saver for them during the course of the FAT. And that, as I said, can be an expensive time because you're flying in a lot of people to a central location to do that kind of activity. The other one that has been talked about in terms of benefits is a very large job, again by another oil major, where they looked at the end of the FAT, they found they had about 6% of the database was in error, and they estimated that to fix that, if they hadn't picked it up first of all, and they would have to fix it during commissioning, it would cost 10 times as much as fixing it during FAT time, and there's some truth in that, right? So when you're at commissioning, it's expensive. You know, this is now, time is critical. You do not want the control system to be on the critical path. That should not happen. And so they figured that, you know, you really can run into millions of dollars of savings if you start delaying startup of the plant. For ourselves, I would certainly concur that, you know, use of Doc 4000 pays for itself in the way it reduces the risk to cost and or schedule overrun. So we do recommend it to many of our customers. And indeed, you know, it is something that we've widely used on a lot of projects. I just want to finish with this one summary. So here, basically, Doc 4000 and Project Integrity really form a single platform then to synchronize all of those disparate databases that you may use during the course of a plant project development, and really helps you take that plant through the project execution where you start the plant up, through the life cycle where you may end up migrating that plant as a legacy system into a newer system. Honeywell, indeed, let me just add, has, we use Doc 4000 a lot. We've used it in 350 plus sites that have Honeywell controls. And as I mentioned, we used it on one of the large gas plants out in the Middle East. We also are currently using it on a new refinery we're building in the Middle East and the associated power plant. Let me just think of a couple of others that we've used. So, for example, a large alumina plant, and many of one company's alumina plants that are all Honeywell. A polypropylene plant that we did recently, also in the Middle East. A West Coast refinery that had an expansion, so that was a legacy system. And we've used it on, as I mentioned before, we've used it on systems that are both legacy and competitive systems. So we find that it really is a great tool. And indeed, one of our latest projects are large oil sands projects in Canada that we're just kicking off. We've also we're also making use of Doc 4000 there. So with that, I want to thank you very much. If there are any questions, I'm happy to take them.